Let me introduce our guest speaker tonight, LeeAnn Kriegh. She grew up on the swampy side of the Cascades in St. Helens and lived in Minnesota and on the birding oasis of Sauvie Island, there in the Columbia River, before settling in Bend. During her student years, she earned a BS, an MA, and a second MA, and that leaves you to spell out what that means. Her love of nature and the outdoors came later in life than it does for many, but she's doing her best to make up for lost time. She wrote her 2 nature guides while also working as a writer and editor for businesses and nonprofits. She writes the occasional article for The Source weekly, and earlier in her career wrote travel, sports, and human interest stories for the Oregonian newspaper and various magazines. You can read about her nature books at www.natureofbooks.com. An updated version of The Nature of Bend came out in the spring of 2022, and both books will be available after the talk tonight. So,
was nice enough to invite me here to talk about my 2 books, The Nature of Bend and The Nature of Portland. And in addition, to talk about a few stories that I uncovered while researching those 2 books. So I'm going to tell you 3 stories about 3 different bird researchers. I'm excited to get to those stories, but first I'm going to start by talking about the 2 books. And so it was 2013 or so when I had this idea to write a nature guide. I'm a writer, and I was falling in love with the nature of this place, and I thought I could put together a book that at the time I was calling The Wild Side. And I didn't know anything about how to write a book. So one of the first things that I did was call a local bookstore. And so I called Paulina Springs Books, and I got lucky because Sue Tank answered the phone. And Sue, many of you know, is a wonderful birder and a huge nature lover. She asked to be represented by a raven. This is what our conversation sounded like. We have deep voices. One of the first questions I had to ask her was, is there any interest for a nature guide that would be specifically about Central Oregon? And she said, yes, actually, we have tourists come in, they want to know. We have people who've moved here recently, they want to know. And we have long-term residents, and they want to know. So yes. And that was huge. And again, Sue's talking to a stranger on the phone. She could have shot down my idea right there, but she didn't. She encouraged it. So that was great. Then I said, well, I have this rough idea. I'm not a photographer, so I'm thinking a black and white book where I just tell stories about species, and maybe I could get some 8 pages of color photos in the middle. And she said, that's a terrible idea. That will never work. You have to have color photos of every species, over 300 species as it turned out, or it's not going to work. So there's interest, but this is impossible. The price, I told her I wanted to reach people like you who are nature lovers already, and I wanted to reel in newbies, right? People who just go for hikes and they don't notice what's around them. And for them, I thought we needed a lower price point. And she said, yeah, I think you're right, $20. So $20 for a full color book, totally impossible. And then I don't know if I talked to her about the publishing thing, but I wanted to mention, I at some point sent off a book proposal to a publisher, and I described the idea, and they took 6 months to respond. And during that time, I kept going with my research. And they responded and they said, great idea, we love it. Central Oregon's too small of a market. You can't sell enough books here. So just do what you're thinking, but for the entire state of Oregon. Yeah, for $20, right? And it will be 1,200 pages long, and it'll come out, you know, in 2037. So, so I just decided the only way to do this is to self-publish it. So I had this big photo problem. And around about this time, I went out for breakfast with an old friend, Ann Malkin. We went to Chow, And she said, oh, I happen to know a photographer. She's in my book club. She's 80 years old and she takes some photos. I said, okay, well, I'll talk to her. Well, her friend was M.A. Wilson. And M.A., if you don't know, she passed away a few years ago. But M.A. was an amazing photographer and a prolific photographer and an incredibly smart and generous woman. And her passion was photographing specifically wildflowers of Central Oregon and the Arctic. The woman went everywhere. So I remember standing in my office on the phone with this 80-year-old, and she's blowing me away. And I said, so I understand you have a few photos. She said, I have thousands of photos. And I said, well, could I have a few for this book I'm putting together? And she said, you can have all of them. And that was the moment the book became possible. Just her generosity, again, to a total stranger that she's talking to on the phone. So as I say, her passion was wildflower photography, but she did take some wonderful photos of birds as well. These are a couple of them. Yeah. So I had another problem. I had so many problems to solve. The other problem is that I'm a newcomer to this. I'm a writer, but I'm not an expert. I'm not a botanist or a biologist or any of those things. And so I needed experts to help me with every single species. And for birds, I don't remember how I got introduced to this guy, but somehow I crossed paths with Chuck Gates, who asked to be represented by a Junco and this specific Junco photo. I think Chuck has a neck. I think he's selling himself short. This is what our conversation sounded like.
LeeAnn, we cannot see the Zoom images on Zoom.
Uh-oh.
We cannot see the image. So
Oh,
if
no,
somebody's
this is-
watching the chat, we on Zoom cannot see. We can only see a slight proportion of your PowerPoint.
That is sad. Give us a minute here. Thanks for letting me know. Did that help?
Perfect.
Yes,
Oh, good. Okay.
that's it.
Oh, amazing. So Chuck, unfortunately, oh, you can collapse it. That going? No.
On the top of the sidebar.
Oh, not stop share. Oh my God. Oh my God. Okay.
The top of the sidebar where the pictures are, click on the sidebar again with the pictures. With that.
Oh, uh-huh.
There you go. And then the left-hand most icon.
That's what we're after. Okay. I'm so sorry, people. So Chuck Gates is a phenomenal birder, and he couldn't be here tonight. He was really sorry about that. He is such a difficult person to work with, as you all know. So I think I met him over email. I said, I'm doing this book. Would you help me out? Would you provide information and edit everything I write? He said, of course. And, you know, I would send like the entire book chapter to him and he would write back within a couple days with all of his edits. He provided every species in the book, including the birds, has hotspots or the really common places you can see and hear the species. He provided all of that. The dates that they're in Central Oregon, he provided that. He corrected most of my mistakes. And Chuck is a good photographer. And so he provided a lot of photos. And he's humble. And he would send me a photo and say, this is crummy. You should talk to Tom Lawler, or you should talk to somebody else. And so he formed the connections for so many other photos. So in all, uh-oh. Yeah, now it doesn't want to progress. Oh, maybe if I click here. Yes. Yeah, but you can't see the top of it. Anyway, this says, these are the experts who helped me with the Bend book alone. There's a whole separate list for the Portland book. And you can see Chuck's name is on there. Some of these people, like Chuck, helped me with entire chapters. Sue Anderson made the entire butterfly section possible. My gosh, I exchanged more than 500 emails with Ron Halverson, who's a botanist. Alan St. John is our wonderful herp expert who literally wrote the book on herps in Oregon. So he was all about that. And then there are other people who just helped with 1 or 2 or 5 species. All of this was just a passion project, a community project to get this thing done. And then this next slide is the list of photographers who helped. Dozens of people, amateurs, professionals. If you go in the back of either book, you can see short bios for every photographer, and those who sell their work, you can go to their websites and support them, which is a great idea. It's a great way to give gifts, to put prints on your wall with some of these gorgeous photos. So that's it. I wanted to prove to you that it really was a community project, and I hope I've done my work. I would love to stop talking for like a minute if there's a quick question, and otherwise I can dive right into the 3 stories I wanted to share with you.
How long did it take you from beginning to end?
How long did it take? The Bend book took a little over 2 years to put together and publish. One of the nice things about self-publishing is that you don't have to wait as long. Once it was ready, I sent it to the printer and away we went. Yeah. So it initially came out in 2016, and then it's been updated a bit for 2022. Yeah.
How many of these people did you meet in person?
Well, since then, I've met a number of them. But at the time, a lot of it was by phone and email. Yeah. Yeah. The generosity was incredible. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to continue on and tell you the first of the 3 stories of bird researchers. This guy I call the bird observer. You may have heard of him. His name is Darwin. This is so unfortunate. Is there any way to get rid of that bar across the top?
I think you can move it down
Oh, okay.
somewhere else.
Yes. Oh. Well, let's do that for now. Okay.
There's a way to get rid of it.
Mm.
You can also make it go
Check this
vertical.
more and see
Oh.
if there's something there.
Oh my God. Hide video panel?
Yeah,
No, that's that.
Hide.
Oh my God. Hide floating media. Oh,
like that.
yes. So you may have heard this guy, Darwin. He had some thoughts on birds and how they evolved. He wrote that the swiftness of wing has been acquired by hawks and swallows to pursue their prey. And the proboscis of admirable structure has been acquired by the bee, the moth, and the hummingbird for plundering the nectaries of flowers. They evolved for specific purposes. He also wrote that some birds have acquired harder beaks to crack nuts, and others broad beaks, like this northern shoveler, to filtrate the water of lakes. And he concluded, based on his research of birds and others, he said, would it be too bold to imagine that in the great length of time since the earth began to exist, perhaps millions of ages before the commencement of the history of mankind, i.e. maybe not the way the religious folks have taught us, would it be too bold to imagine that all warm-blooded animals have risen from one living filament? Dynamic stuff, and I'm sorry, you don't seem surprised. I'm not talking about Charles Darwin, I'm talking about his grandfather. Erasmus Darwin was the one who wrote that and had those thoughts. He died before Charles was even born. So this guy who I have a huge crush on, he was a physician in the middle of England near Birmingham. You don't want to get treated by this guy. He was doing his best, but there was a lot of bloodletting. He was married twice. He had 14 or 15 kids. 2 of them were out of wedlock, maybe 3 of them. He was anti-slavery. He was for prison reform. He was pro-French Revolution. He was pro-American Revolution. He was a friend of Ben Franklin. He was so progressive in his ideas. He was a member of the fairly famous Lunar Society of some of the leading thinkers of the time, like James Watt, who invented the steam engine. They were called the Lunar Society because they met near the full moon so that they could see their way home after the meeting, probably inebriated. They called themselves lunatics. And as I said, he came up with a coherent theory of evolution 70 years before his grandson, Charles Darwin. Amazing, and we'll come back to that. So here he is on the left, and that's Charles on the right. As I'll show you, Erasmus was an amazing inventor. One thing that there's a museum for Erasmus Darwin, and it said one of his inventions was a semicircle cut in his dining room table so that his belly would fit, so that he would get closer to his dinner. No idea why that didn't stay with us, but other inventions by the other Darwin. He was the first to explain the full system of photosynthesis. Others had pieces of it. He was the first to explain how clouds form. He invented a copying machine. He invented a canal lift. He invented a steering technology that is used in modern cars. He sketched a hydrogen-oxygen rocket engine 100 years before anybody else would have that idea. He was like Elon Musk if Elon Musk were a nice person. He drew an artificial bird closer to the truth of bird flight than anyone before him. He imagined it being powered by gunpowder that would charge a combustion engine that had not yet been invented. And at the museum, they brought it to fruition, his drawing. A few more reasons to love Erasmus. My hiking friends are here and they know I find ways to bring Erasmus up on hikes. Yeah. And I limited myself on how many reasons to love Erasmus. When he was told that a mother had drowned her illegitimate daughter, right? It'd be so easy to pile on. What a terrible thing to do, right? He wrote back, "The women that have committed this most unnatural crime are real objects of our greatest pity. What struggles must be in their minds, what agonies." He empathized. Similarly, when the Spaniards conquered Mexico and Peru, no doubt many were cheering, but Erasmus wrote a poem. He said, "Spain's deathless shame, the crimes of modern days, when avarice, shrouded in religion's robe, sailed to the west and slaughtered half the globe. The slave in chains on supplicating knee, are we not brethren? Sorrow chokes the rest." And I ruined his rhyme, but I just wanted to show he was so anti-slavery. He argued with Samuel Taylor Coleridge about religion, and I'm not saying this is accurate, but I find it so funny. About Unitarianism, Erasmus wrote, "It is a feather bed to catch a falling Christian." To a friend who hadn't written him in some time, he wrote, "Not having heard of you for so many moons has induced me to think you are dead. Pray send me word that I may begin your epitaph." He was funny, he was a poet, he was a botanist, he was an inventor. On retirement, he had wise words. "It is a dangerous experiment and generally ends either in drunkenness or hypochondriacism." And then to his friends who enjoyed a drink, he wrote, "O mortal man that livest by bread, what makes thy nose to look so red? 'Tis Burton ale so strong and stale that keeps my nose from growing pale." But back to evolution and the price of speaking out. So there was a Darwin coat of arms, and Erasmus added a motto at the bottom. And the motto translates as "everything from shells." That's kind of a weird phrase, but there were shells on the coat of arms. And so he was trying to make oblique reference to the idea that we all come from earlier organisms. And he thought he could get away with that. It's not too obvious. He painted the motto on his carriage that he used as a doctor to travel around treating people. But a church leader, a local church leader who had supported him, was not at all amused. The Reverend Thomas Seward wrote to Erasmus, and see if this gives you chills. He said, "O doctor, change thy foolish motto, or keep it for some lady's grotto, else thy poor patients well may quake, if thou no more canst mend than make." In other words, I will take away your livelihood if you don't keep quiet about evolution. And Erasmus Darwin never spoke to this man again, even though he was friends with his daughter. He painted over the motto on his carriage for fear of losing his livelihood. He kept his thoughts on evolution quiet for another 24 years until he was toward the end of his life. And then he has some great lines about not caring anymore. And he published the ideas in a book called Zoonamia, which was a big success, but the timing was bad. England was in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars, and it was all God and country. And so it didn't catch on. And so Charles did read his grandfather's work, but he said it didn't produce any effect on him. He read it as a teenager, and it wouldn't be until 1859 that finally On the Origin of Species came out. So that's it. On him, I just wanted to share that story. I can't take questions now because I got to run through the next two stories, but thank you for letting me put my crush out into the world. The second story I wanted to share with you, I call him the bird collector. This is a darker story, but I think well worth hearing, especially as Oregonians. This is about John Kirk Townsend, who lived from the early to the mid 1800s. Handsome guy, came west at the age of 24. He was a physician, he was a naturalist, and he was a really good bird collector. He also, not important, but he looks like Benedict Cumberbatch, Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Strange. John Kirk Townsend came west, as I said. He was invited by a botanist, Thomas Nuttall, to be part of Nathaniel Wyeth's second trip to the Pacific Ocean. Long story short, Wyeth came west one time to Oregon and didn't have success. Decided to come again. And this time he was going to bring a botanist to collect plants and and Townsend to collect birds. They spent time at Fort Vancouver, which I'll show you, and at Fort William, which was a fort that they established for 2 years only on Sauvie Island. Townsend published a journal with the title you see in that third bullet, a journal about this trip west. He's a really good writer. It's really worth reading, and pretty much everything I quote comes from that journal. So just to show you, I'm using my cursor. So the red marker, that's Fort Vancouver in Vancouver, Washington now. The big blue strip, that is the Columbia River, where it turns north before it turns west toward the ocean. Coming from the bottom of the screen, the smaller blue strip, that's the Willamette River running into the Columbia. An offshoot of the Willamette is Multnomah Channel, which also runs north all the way up here. So Fort William was located on the Multnomah Channel for 2 years. And in between the Multnomah Channel and the Columbia River is Sauvie Island. This is Sturgeon Lake and some other lakes in here. For what it's worth, I lived around here on Sauvie Island. I grew up, as we said, in St. Helens, which is just north. But truth be told, I grew up in Yankton, which I can't believe is on this map. It's an unincorporated community west of St. Helens. So this story just really hits home for me. He was a great collector. Audubon's, did I spell that wrong? Sorry. Audubon's Birds of America, his famous book, has 508 bird species. 74 of those species he got from Townsend's collections. They ended up fighting, lots of ego. I'm not going to go into it. Point being, Townsend was a great bird collector. During the trip west, he also wrote about his love of what he was doing. He said, "None but a naturalist can appreciate a naturalist's feelings, his delight amounting to ecstasy when a specimen such as he's never seen before meets his eye." He has great tales of his collections. Also a funny story, he carried a 2-gallon bottle of whiskey where he put lizards and snakes. You know what happened. He left to go to the Willamette Falls. He left his whiskey behind. A couple guys decanted it, drank all the whiskey while he was gone, ticked Townsend off. He had worked hard to collect all those specimens. They were ruined. Bill Sullivan jokes, this is why we don't have a Townsend newt. This is a juvenile Townsend solitaire. We do have lots of species named after this guy, the Townsend solitaire, Townsend warbler, bat, mole, chipmunk, squirrel, etc. And he named other species. So for instance, he named the Vox's swift, which is named after William Vox, who gave money to Townsend to go west. The thing is, William Vox was not a birder at all. He was a mineralogist. It's just silly that we're stuck with this name, at least for now, of Vox's swift. So now I'm getting to the crux of it. So I'm going to pick on OSU Press because they wrote an intro to his journal. They sell it online. And they said he had an ambivalent relationship with Indians. And I have to say, I pick on them, but others don't mention his relationship with Indians at all. And all too often, it's a very cursory description of his relationship. So the thing is, Townsend collected skulls for a guy named Dr. Samuel George Morton, who wrote, quote, the most important work in the history of scientific racism. His ideas encouraged Indian removal policies. People like Andrew Jackson drew support from Morton's work. And Townsend, as well as Audubon, sent skulls so that Morton could measure the skulls to prove his racist and entirely incorrect theory that Caucasians had bigger brains than other people. And I would love to tell you more about how wrong his science was. It's absurd, but people bought into it, and it supported white supremacy, and it supported the idea that we should just move Native Americans out. Townsend knew what he was doing was wrong in terms of stealing the skulls. He wrote, I've been very anxious to procure the skulls, but if the sacrilege should be discovered, a prejudice might thus be excited against our little colony. He wrote to Morton about Chinook people and other Native people. They described them as savages, little better than brute beasts. So let's just back up a couple minutes on who the Chinook people really were. The Chinook peoples of the Lower Columbia, there's a wonderful book by that name that I highly recommend. Also, Oregon Historical Society has good information, and ChinookNation.org, among other resources. I want to emphasize I'm a really imperfect vessel for this information. I'm not a historian. I'm not an expert on it. I'm also a white person who has benefited from the removal and other atrocities committed against Native people. I'm telling the story in hopes that you'll do your own research and it'll spur conversation. And hopefully in your research, you'll hear Native voices instead of my voice. So when Townsend got there, there were dozens of Chinook villages located along the Columbia River. A thriving population of thousands on Sauvie Island, the Multnomah Band of Chinook. So this map, it starts in the east at Cascade Locks, and this is the Lower Columbia as it stretches all the way to the ocean. Every number you see was a Chinook village. And you see the cluster of villages around Sauvie Island where the Columbia turns north. They were doing so well, and they were tradespeople because they had people coming from the north and the south. They had Native people from Vancouver Island coming in, and then eventually starting in the 1790s, they had white people coming in. The Chinook people were in control. There were thousands of them, and they did trade with these other people, and that's how it happened. They lived in these incredible, some of them lived in these incredible longhouses. This is a reproduction built in part by modern Chinook people. They were, as you can imagine, remarkable canoeists on the Columbia River. This is an Edward Curtis picture. Here's the thing, 90%, more than 90% of them died between 1800 and the 1830s. Specifically, 1830 itself, just before Townsend got there, malaria came and just decimated the population. So they, malaria, influenza, smallpox, these diseases that they didn't have any natural immunity to, wiped out the populations and shifted that power. So now Townsend comes in. So what does he make of this? He says there's an epidemic raging among them, which carries them off so fast that the cemeteries will soon lack watchers. I don't rejoice in the prospect of the death of the poor creatures, certainly, but then, it'll be very convenient for my purposes. I just want to emphasize the Chinook tribe, it still exists. It's a united community, but it's not federally recognized. Read the story. It's terrible. ChinookJustice.org. You can go there. You can sign a petition. You can donate money. They deserve federal recognition. So let's go back. Ambivalent relationship with Indians. So the tip of Sauvie Island, has anybody been here? A couple people, is Warrior Rock and this wonderful lighthouse. You can hike out there anytime you want. Not far, this is the northern tip, not far from there is where this story takes place. 1836, Townsend saw a canoe 14 feet up in the branches of a tree. That's how some Chinook people honored their dead. A perfect embalmed body of a young female is inside. So what should Townsend do? Well, it's broad daylight, so he knows what he's doing is wrong. So he's going to come back at midnight to steal her body. And that's what he does. He takes it to Fort William. He couldn't take it to Fort Vancouver the next day on a boat because he had paid some Indians to paddle his canoe and they would see the body. So nope, he's got to hide the body at Fort William. He asks a white friend, please watch over the body. Don't let anything happen to it. Well, while he's at Fort Vancouver, he gets a note from his friend. The friend says, the brother of the deceased girl found that empty canoe on the spot that was hallowed to him, writes Townsend. And he went to Fort William looking for his sister. He saw by the footprints that it was a white person who had taken her. Townsend's friend said he gave the girl's body back to her brother with a present of a few blankets to prevent the circumstance from operating upon his mind to the prejudice of the white people. You stole my sister, but thanks for the blankets, right? And Townsend then writes this. He says, the poor Indian took the body of his sister upon his shoulders, and as he walked away, grief got the better of his stoicism, and the sound of his weeping was heard long after he had entered the forest. And I read this to my partner, and she said, so he stopped, right? No, he didn't stop. He collected more skulls. One more thing, he visited a chief later that year. The chief welcomed him into the house, regaled him with food. Townsend wrote of the encounter, I can testify that inhospitality is not among the number of their failings. I never went into the house of an Indian in my life in any part of the country without being most cordially received and welcomed. So I think details matter. It's one thing to just say he stole skulls. It's another thing to hear that whole story. And this, of course, led me to really support the Bird Names for Birds movement that you've probably heard of. It seems to be gaining steam. As David Sibley said, basically, why do we saddle birds with the baggage of humans, right? I think I wanted to end with a native voice, so let me just show you what Stephen Carr Hampton, an enrolled citizen of Cherokee Nation, says about this. It's a privilege of being white to be able to ignore these things, to hear these names with the same clean joy as so many evocative and descriptive names like indigo bunting. The whole honorific name game that spread through the American West in the mid-1800s is a hot mess, entangled with the white supremacy of the age, and somehow deaf to progressive white voices at that time, as well as to Native and Black voices. At the AOS Congress on English bird names last year, David Sibley said changing these bird names would allow people of all backgrounds to have simple and uncomplicated conversations about the pleasure of watching birds, people like me, for instance. Yeah, so I know it's a dark story, but again, as Oregonians, I think it's a story that we all should know. It frustrates me that growing up here, I never knew that story. One more lighter story to end with. This is about a bird lover. Margaret Morse, I think it's niece. She lived for 90 years. She was born in 1880 year, which was also the year that the American Ornithological Union had its first meeting. So Margaret joked that that was an important year for ornithologists because she was born and they had their first meeting. She published a booklet on birds in fruit orchards at the age of 12. She came out of the womb collecting data. Just amazing. Her mom was a very stoic, unemotional woman, and Margaret was just out in the field from the start, collecting data. She studied chickens in her backyard. She didn't run around with the chickens like most kids. She studied them. She realized there was a pecking order before the term pecking order was invented. She earned her master's in studying northern bobwhites, and she was going to get her PhD, but love intervened. She married a professor who supported her, fortunately for her, the rest of her life and her career. She had 5 daughters over 11 years. 5 daughters in 11 years. And you can imagine she didn't have time to be studying birds during those 11 years. So she did what only Margaret would do. She studied her children. She published 18 articles about child development and language development. She couldn't help herself. This is her with a Song Sparrow nest. It's the most famous photo of her. She co-authored with her husband, The Birds of Oklahoma, just after she was kind of free of the kids a little bit. That drew acclaim. She also studied the nesting of mourning doves. Hunters said, well, they're done nesting in October, so we can hunt then. And she said, no, 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 I can prove that's not true. You have to wait till later in the year. And that's what she did. That's just one example. She was a dedicated environmentalist. She was protecting wildlife refuges. Her legacy comes in many forms. In her lifetime, she published 244 papers. She authored 7 books. She wrote 3,000, right? Jerry knows, 3,000 book reviews. I wanted to home in on her, what I call her Song Sparrow years. In 1927, she moved to Ohio because her husband got a job at the university. That same year, one of her daughters died. Eleanor died. And Margaret, there's a saying, she kept her feelings tucked in her purse next to her money. She only spoke of this very briefly, even to her other children. She was devastated, but she didn't know how to talk about her grief. What she did know how to do was to focus her energy into studying birds, and that's what she did. She spent the next 8 years studying and banding 870 song sparrows. She said the existing info on them was meager and all of it wrong. She studied everything about them: songs, territoriality, learning ability, nesting habits, social behavior. She used colored leg bands she made from her children's toys. And she published a 2-volume work eventually. It was an astonishing work because nobody was doing longitudinal work like this, studying animal behavior in the field of a common species using the banding. She was just an absolute innovator, and she was awarded the Brewster Medal in 1942. But let's home in just a little bit more. May 1935, she tracked 1 male song sparrow for 24 hours. She named him M4. He spent 10 hours singing, 9 hours roosting, 5 hours eating and other stuff. She counted how many songs. Her daughters were bringing her food as she sat out in the field. She counted 2,305 songs, one after the other. And I thought that was astonishing, and I put that in the Portland book. Well, another part of her legacy, separate from this, was that she spoke several languages. So she connected European ornithologists with American ornithologists. She was a relationship builder, and that was incredibly important in furthering ornithology. She also mentored a number of people, including this woman. And that woman, Lawrence, wanted to count red-eyed vireo songs, like her mentor had counted Song Sparrow songs. Well, the red-eyed vireo is known as the preacher bird. It's like the Chihuahua of birds. And so that bird sang 22,197 songs in 14 hours, which remains the record if any of you want to try to break that record. And that's I can't count that high. And that's really all I have for you. It's past my bedtime. I'm going to sneak off. Thank you all very much.
For those of you, maybe I have to unmute it too.
You want me to move?
Yes. I'll probably have to remute. Does anyone in the Zoom land have any questions? You can unmute yourself and.
I'm open to ideas. All of Oregon, yeah. I just want to talk about Erasmus Darwin. Okay, do you want to just talk on this? Oh, that's good. Anyway, yeah.
So how are they going to change all the bird things?
Well, it's under discussion. It's certainly a challenge to think of doing that, and you think about the common names and then also the scientific names and the abbreviations. I shared that story in part because it is a challenge, and so there has to be really some passion behind it. And for me, that story gave me that passion, right? To just think, well, yeah, it's hard, so let's figure it out. Yeah, yeah.
I'm something where the museum
I think it's near Birmingham in England. Yeah, I didn't go there, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I would love to. I know. Yeah. 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 Jerry, you
I
probably.
have a curious point to raise.
Well, wait, about her question.
Well, it's the alien you can decide. But I want to ask you, and one thing knows, there is, as far as I know, only one North American bird which we use. It's Native American.
And
In any of our assembly.
No, Jerry.
All over the US. No, but I don't know where that would go.
In the folks on Zoom.
I think it's from the south. The bird I'm thinking of is the sorrel.
Oh, nice.
And I believe that sorrel is the name for that bird that was used by the Delaware Indians. So it goes back to the East Coast and the earliest colonies.
Nice. Yeah, and it no doubt would be a challenge to rename birds, but also an opportunity, right, to come up with better descriptive names. Any other questions? Okay, and again, for the folks here, the book is available at half price. Both books are available at half price. If you would like to purchase some as gifts or for yourself, I'll be back there after the talk. Thank you.